a moment just to talk about Brother Ross. It was here on Sunday, and a couple of things he said. It's going to lead in a little bit to what we're going to talk about tonight. He and Nancy are very special people to me. When I was a teenager, I was in Van Buren, Ross referenced a couple times. He was one of our elders. And he's the reason that I preach and teach right now. No doubt about it. He's the one that taught me to outline, to get through sermons. You can, good, bad, or indifferent from that. You can blame him the next time you see him if you're not happy with that outcome. But I was raised by two parents that were and still are Christians, and wonderful parents. That's no statement about them, but sometimes you need somebody that's skilled like he is to help you, and he's very much instrumental. And Sunday was kind of a bit of one of those days of nostalgia, I guess, because you think about all the days growing up back home. He mentioned a guy named John Brown. He was the one that led singing the night they obeyed the gospel. Some of you know John. He's just a very neat individual, if you know some of the challenges he's overcome in his life. And then there's been the announcements of the Kerrs. Well, we worshiped in Jackson, Tennessee for almost 2 years with Gary and Susan. They also are very special people to us, and Susan's been a faithful servant of the Lord. As many of you know, my parents moved there, and within 10 days, my dad was in the hospital, told he had a heart attack, had a 100% blocked artery. And I met most of the elders in his hospital room and became very close to Gary and Susan at that time, as you can imagine. And throughout the years, we've stayed in some contact. So there's a lot of people we need to keep them in our prayers and pray for. And I hope that he can come back when Bruce is gone, because I think we can certainly benefit from his sermons, and it gives you a break from guys like me and Sammy and others that get up here from time to time. No offense, Sammy. Just wanted to pick on Sammy. It gave me another opportunity to do it. So, Ross on Sunday morning was talking about providence, and he mentioned Romans chapter 8 being one of the, in his opinion, the most abused passages in the Bible. And so the lesson that we were intending to talk about tonight, as I told you last week, is the idea of judge not from Luke chapter 6. I want you to go ahead and turn there. And I want to talk a little bit about the story that Luke records for us in chapter 6. And we want to talk about it a little bit, and I don't know exactly, maybe spend the first half of the class talking about what it says and some other related passages. But really, as a connection to that, I want to use this verse to kind of lead in, hopefully in the latter part of class, to this idea of some passages that are taken out of context, this idea of proof texting, even, just the idea of passages sometimes that are abused. And I think there's a conversation that we can have this evening that will be beneficial related to that. Before we get there, let's talk about the next few weeks, because we've got a few things that are a little, I'm telling you. Okay. So tonight, obviously, we're going to talk about it. So we've got the gospel meeting next week with Bubba Green or Bubba Garner, whoever decides to show up. And then the week after that, Dee and I are planning to be out of town visiting family. So I don't know who's going to be here yet. We'll determine that. But when I plan to come back in 3 weeks, we're going to talk about this idea of do not worry that we find in the Gospel of Luke. So that's what you'll want to prepare for if you think about it. That's what we'll plan to talk about in a few weeks, and I'll try to kind of give you the schedule each week so you can prepare for the following week as we've discussed. So without any other introduction, let's begin reading in Luke, the 6th chapter, in verse 37. Luke, the 6th chapter, beginning in verse 37. Jesus says, "Judge not, and you shall not be judged. Condemn not, and you shall not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over will be put into your bosom. For with the same measure that you use, it will be measured back to you. And he spoke a parable to them, can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall into the ditch? The disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone who is perfectly trained will be like his teacher. And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not perceive the plank in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, Brother, let me remove the speck that is in your eye, when you yourself do not see the plank that is in your own eye? Hypocrite, first remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck that is in your brother's eye. So what part of this context do we normally hear people, kind of quote? Well, it's the first part that we read, judge not, and you shall not be judged. And when does that normally come into the picture? Okay. When else? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sure. Where else do you see this? All over. In our world, it's all over social media. Somebody posts a Bible verse, and then all of a sudden, usually they quote a parallel passage, which is Matthew 7, and then we're off to the races, right? Okay, so let's talk about, most of us know this passage, so I don't want to I want to talk about the text, but I don't want to spend the time. We've had teaching here at Highway 65 on this verse, and I'm not trying to redo that. But what's condemned in the passage? Let's start there. There's I would say a couple of types of judgments that are condemned to start with. Hypocritical, so being a hypocrite, okay? So if I have an issue with a particular sin, and I'm not going to go down a list, you all know several of them, I don't get the right to come over here to Brother Todd and say, Todd, you really have an issue with X, Y, Z. And Todd knows that I'm not consistent in my faith. Okay, or if I'm not living righteously, I don't need to be running around talking to others. That would be one thing. Hypocritical. What else? Maybe being overly critical or hypercritical, we would call that. I kind of sometimes hesitant to get into Greek because I'm not, much on, let me say this the right way. I am big on looking at the Greek words. I am not a Greek scholar, nor do I know how to read it, okay? I sometimes feel like I do good just to take care of English. So you got to be careful, right? But the Greek word used here for judge is a word, and I would call it krino or krino. Brother Caldwell, actually referencing Thayer's Greek lexicon, said that word could also be translated separate, distinguish, esteem, prefer, determine, decide, pronounce an opinion concerning right and wrong, condemn, find fault with. So when most people come around, they point out, they say, you should not judge. What are they implying or inferring when they say that? That that's about 6 lines down on my outline, so good job. All right, so, and we'll talk about that. But sometimes they're meaning, hey, don't say anything to me. I don't want to hear about anything that the Bible has to say. Sometimes it might be that you've said something. We've all had a point where someone, we'd call it being pricked, right? A preacher maybe said something or somebody else said something, and it kind of got us good, right? And then sometimes the natural is to go on the defensive. But there may be something else that sometimes Christians do. I don't know so much maybe in our day and time, maybe they do, but sometimes Christians put themselves in the place of God. You're going to hell if you do that. You're not going to be saved. You need to be real careful about that. Putting our place in it's one thing to say the Bible teaches against this and to try to talk to people and correct people and to help each other, whether that's people within our congregation or people that we come in contact with. But we need to be very careful about putting ourselves in the place of God and being the final judge. And so I think there's a lot about this passage that is just completely taken out of context, but I think there's also some situations that Christians have overstepped their bounds in talking to other people and maybe even kind of lost the right spirit or attitude in doing it. But as we go back to some of the ways this passage could be translated, when it says, "Judge not, and you shall not be judged. Condemn not, and you shall not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven," seems to be talking about a spirit or an attitude that we would have. It's not telling us that we can't make a determination. That's clearly not what the passage is saying. There's things that we have to make determinations about. It's not saying that we can't look at something and decide if something's right or wrong. It's not saying we can't counsel somebody in something. I actually think a lot of the issue is when people use the word judge, they sometimes, it's a matter of how you're using the word, okay? Sometimes they're talking about final judgment. We're not even talking about that. We're just talking about making a determination that something is right or wrong, and people hear the word judge and they think about in judgment. I think sometimes that's part of the issue. So I think the passage is not teaching that we can't make a determination. I think we know that from the passage. If you look at this passage and also the parallel account in Matthew, which is in Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through 6, and let's go ahead and turn there. It tells us the same thing, but just to reference it. Go to Matthew chapter 7 and look at verse 5. In Matthew 7 and verse 5, Jesus says, "Hypocrite, first remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." And then look at verse 6. "Do not give what is holy to the dogs, nor cast your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn and tear you in pieces." Now, how are you going to do what it says in verse 6 if you can't make any kind of determination? You couldn't fulfill it, right? Now, I also think we don't need to be running around being the hall monitor, right? Trying to find fault in everybody's lives. I don't think that's the point either. I think the best way to fulfill this passage is to do everything we can to live in a godly manner and to encourage and help each other and try to talk to people and have conversations. And when we see someone that's clearly going astray, if we're in a position that where we can do this and it's not in a hypocritical manner or hypercritical manner, let's do it. Let's help each other. Galatians 6, I think, talks about that some. I'll give you something very interesting happened to me this afternoon. 1 o'clock, I had someone in my office. He is a quote-unquote pastor, and I'm going to mention some denominations. If there's anybody here visiting, I'm not saying these in a way to be critical of anybody where you might attend. But he's a pastor he would call himself at a Southern Baptist church here in the area. I'll leave it at that. No reason to identify him. And to quote him, he's going to talk about some titles in a way that I wouldn't use them. But he said either his dad or his grandfather was a Church of Christ, he said, and his son is a Church of Christ preacher. And he said, I married a lady that attended the Assembly of God. And I grew up, quote unquote, Church of Christ, he said. Again, I wouldn't use the terminology that way, but that's what he said. And so basically it sounded like to me that him and his wife met in the middle. But he said when his son was going to school to get a doctorate, he was looking at everything carefully, and he couldn't continue on with what his dad had taught him. So what do you do if you're me? I'm sitting there in the office, the guy's telling me all this. I'm listening, I'm taking this in now. Keep in mind, I'm kind of quasi-self-employed, but I still have an obligation to my employer. Guy's buying a contract from me, but I've also got this opportunity in front of me, but I know his family history, right? So what do you tell him? I see some of your looks on your face like, what do you say, Well, I kind of listened is the first thing I did. Kind of let him talk a little bit. I wanted to hear him. I've also gathered from talking to him the last couple of days, he's a little bit of a hardhead. Now, everybody you come in contact with in business, some are easy to deal with, some aren't, and there's some people in the middle. So I knew I had to kind of massage this thing a little bit. So we talked a little bit. He said a few things. So what I didn't do was a guy that I just met yesterday, I didn't jump in and say, you know what, I think you're wrong. We didn't have that conversation. Talked about where I worship. We had a little dialogue. I'm quite certain that him and his family, to put it his way, he grew up in the church. I think he knows a few things. So I kind of planted a seed, but I didn't just jump in right away. Now, some of you may be critical, some won't. But the thing I couldn't do today was turn that guy off. I don't know that I'll get anywhere with him or not. His family's probably got a better chance at talking to him than I do. But I at least know where he stands. He knows where I attend. It's a long shot, right? But that might be somebody that might come to a gospel meeting when he's not where he's at, right? But you don't want to jump in my opinion, and say, hey, you can't do this, and this. He talked about, finding common ground in certain areas, and we talked about a few things, and that was obviously a tough situation. I didn't know I was going to get to even have that conversation today, but you kind of got to be ready, right? Point being, go ahead, Alan. Yeah. And that's my point on this both ways, is you can come out and turn somebody off, not by preaching the gospel, but the way you come at somebody. And so I think we need to be careful of that.
Anything else, we're not going to do everything.
Yep.
But do learn is prepare you for next time situation. Better idea how you do.
So let's talk about one of those times where the hammer was laid down. Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 5.
While you're turning there,
Okay, go ahead, brother.
you and of some have compassion, making a difference, and others take with fear, pulling out of the fire, hating evil.
Yeah.
Some compassion,
Yep.
others.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a little bit of a judgment call, Sometimes you gotta learn what's going on. So Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 is writing this letter, I think to Kevin's point. There was a lot of issues at the church at Corinth, I think probably going on for some time. And he says in 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 1, it is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and such sexual immorality as is not even named among the Gentiles, that a man has his father's wife. And you are puffed up and have not mourned, that he who has done this deed might be taken away from you. For I indeed, as absent in body but present in spirit, have already judged, there's our word, as though I were present, him who has so done this deed. In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, when you are gathered together along with my spirit, with the power of our Lord Jesus Christ, deliver such a one to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord Jesus. Your glorying is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Therefore purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you are truly unleavened. For indeed Christ our Passover was sacrificed for us. And Apostle Paul goes on at the end of the chapter, says, therefore put away from yourselves the evil person. You know, at some point, of course, he was writing the church at Corinth here, but he had to make a judgment, a determination about what needed to be done. He did that under inspiration, of course. But there's clearly a situation when that has to be done. Brother Tom mentioned John 7 and verse 24. Let's turn there. John 7 and verse 24. Most of you know this passage. You begin actually in verse 21. It says, Jesus answered and said to them, I did one work, and you all marvel. Moses therefore gave you circumcision, not as it is from Moses, but from the fathers, and you circumcised a man on the Sabbath. If a man receives circumcision on the Sabbath, so that the law of Moses should not be broken, are you angry with me, because I made a man completely well on the Sabbath? Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. So what's Jesus saying here? Gospel of John's the only writer that records this part for us. What's he saying that we might add to what we've already talked about? Yeah. And maybe to not do so superficially. You know, there seems to be, I think, an implication as well to understand the situation. Yeah. Sure. So let's move on a little bit. I mean, I think we know the passage, the context of it, and then, like I say, the last thing we want to talk about as far as this part of class is just the fact that sometimes verses are just plucked out. Now, there might be a time when that's appropriate. I want to give you an example of that. Let's go to Proverbs 22. I want to read verses 6 and 7. Proverbs 22. This is just one example. We could do this several places. Proverbs 22 and verse 6, this is a passage we all know. It says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Look at verse 7. The rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the lender. Now, what do those two passages have to do with each other? Not much of anything that I can tell, right? That happens in the Proverbs and maybe some in the Psalms. So I'm not saying you can go, every time you go grab a verse, that it's wrong to do that to make a point. Or if you just quoted a verse and the context supported it, that absolutely would also be accurate. We see that all the time. But one of these is talking about raising your children. The other one's talking about being a slave to people that you owe money to. Well, they're both in Proverbs. Other than that, there's not a lot, right? And so sometimes it's appropriate to use a verse or two. That's not what we're talking about. We don't have to turn here, but if you went to the book of Romans and you quoted Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, and you said, this is the theme of the book of Romans. The 16 chapters in Romans would support you in that. You would not be proof texting or taking that verse out of context. If you read Romans 1 and verse 5 or 16 and 26, you would be talking about, again, the theme of the book. You wouldn't be taking that out of context. So it's not just reading a verse or two that is the issue. Anybody know what we mean by proof texting? I think some of you. Go ahead, Al, if you wanted to. Yeah. Basically, you start with an idea and then you find the Bible passage to support it instead of the other way around. And sometimes we do that, brethren. I'm going to tell you a lot when that happens. When you've known the truth on a particular issue, and I'm going to use divorce right now, and you've known the truth on that, then suddenly somebody in your family is in a situation, or you're in a situation, and you suddenly look for a way that, not having any basis to remarry, you can remarry. I've had that situation happen. I've heard people in Bible class ask questions, and if they're not angling for a reason, I don't know what that question was doing. They're looking for someone to give them approval. And the reason they've done that is because they went to any passage they could possibly find that might give an angle to give approval. And that's what we do in proof texting. Now, that's just one example. It could be anything. But we have to be very, very careful about that. And this idea of kind of proof texting, plucking a verse, I'm going to read to you a couple snippets of an article. And I purposely went online and did what everybody does now. I pulled up google.com and I said, I want to know the most abused passages in the Bible. I want to get Brother Caldwell's commentaries fine. I want to find somebody that I don't know, and I want to see what they think about it. And there was several passages that came up often. Matthew 7 and verse 1 was one of those. I want to put up, because we don't have much time, but I want to put up, this was one guy. Now, I'm going to tell you this guy. I am not supporting all of what this guy would say. In fact, I'm not even going to give you his name, so you can't go read his stuff, because I don't want you to. Changed my mind. This guy is a director of missions for the Southern Baptist of Texas Convention. Now you know who he is if you want. He said in his mind, these were the 5 most abused passages in the Bible. You do any kind of list, you're going to see that. You'll find that several people in the religious world, maybe your friends that you go to work with or you go to school with, and it could be, there's others we could put, are going to have some of the same feelings about people pulling verses out of the context. Here was a quote in the article he wrote. He said, "The Bible is not merely a collection of quotes or one-liners, but is literally the Word of God. When the Scriptures speak, God is speaking. That is why we must approach the Bible with extreme care and intentionality. How it is read, memorized, and quoted is of utmost importance. However, Christians often misunderstand, misquote, or misuse verses in the Bible. For example, we may turn to the concordance in the back wanting to find a verse on a particular subject, read the one suggested, find a favorite one, and then start quoting away. Or possibly we hear others misquoting verses and sound right in the moment, so we also begin spreading the misuse without taking the time to study the verse in its intended context." Philippians 4 verse 13, "I can do all things through Christ which strengthens me." How many times do you see this in a powerlifting contest? or something else. The Apostle Paul was in prison. He was talking about how he could survive in any situation, whether he had something, he didn't have anything. He learned to be content. And we see this verse quoted today. It has nothing to do with what Paul said. Matthew 18, verse 20. How many people talk, it talks about where two or three together are gathered in my name. How many people use this as justification for not attending the assembly? Most of you know that I fish. I do not tournament fish any longer. I have some issues in my conscience about doing that, so I don't do that any longer. But I still follow the guys that do. They're professional anglers. It's amazing that they make a living chasing around little green fish, but they do it, and they make a lot of money doing it. But I still watch it for the sport of it. And there's a guy on there, a very religious guy to West Memphis. His name's Mark Rose, and he talks about having quote-unquote fishing church. And he promotes on his Facebook page, if some of you guys are going to be out on the lake on Sunday or hunting or whatever, just join us on Facebook for fishing church, and we'll be glad you tuned in with us. So let me get this straight. You can choose not to come to worship, enjoy your pleasure that day, not inconvenience yourself, watch a little 10-minute Facebook devotional by some guy you've never met in your life, and use that as a substitute for the worship that we're called to do with the saints in our local assembly. I don't know how many people I've seen comment on that page, and they quote Matthew chapter 18 and verse 20, and they're quoting this exact passage to support what's been going on. Look, I applaud those guys trying to have a devotional or something while they're out away from their homes. That's not what we're called to do. I get the spirit of what he's trying to do. It doesn't fulfill the command in any way. But promoting this as a substitute and then watching all the people join in doesn't help anything at all. Jeremiah 29 and verse 11. How many of you have seen this quoted? This is probably on the little trinkets they sell at Hobby Lobby and the coffee mugs and the decor you ladies put in your barnwood houses or whatever's in style now. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. People jump into that, right? What happens when one of your relatives comes down with a disease, or is sick, or a friend dies in a car wreck, or something happens to you? What's happened to your theology now? They might want that too. Sometimes you need a bigger airplane, Don. That's for sure. Well, I appreciate your attitude, and we all do. That's not exactly what we're having. No, you're fine. What we're talking about is people that they have no desire to come. They don't want to be inconvenienced. They'd rather engage in their hobby. And then they kind of, this is proof, they just kind of fill this passage in to make them feel better. I mean, a lot of them are sincere. It's just not. Okay, it's okay, Don. So in Jeremiah 29 and verse 11, this is in the context of a 70-year captivity. Any of us under Babylonian captivity today? This kind of goes on with what Brother Ross was talking about. about Romans 8 and verse 28. I've noticed another trend. People talk about being blessed and this idea of God has blessed me. Well, that's usually after they just bought them a new car down at the car lot or got the bigger house or whatever. I'm not against any of that. But what happens when some of these first world things go away again, or you get disease, or you have an issue? Did God suddenly forget about you? I don't think so. I think the problem was the premise that you started with. Football coaches on TV. I watch a lot of football. My wife would probably tell you way too much, okay? I remember Hugh Freeze, that used to coach Ole Miss, talking about, well, God was just with us today. Mike Tomlin of the Steelers, well, the Lord was with us, or something like that. Those aren't exact quotes. Was God an Ole Miss fan? He sure wasn't when that football was thrown over that guy's head on 4th and 25, and we got a first down and beat them in overtime. Was God not with Ole Miss that day? Was God not with Pittsburgh when they lost? There's a lot of proof texting going on, is my point. People talk about how God is with them when we're having all this success in the most materially wealthy country that's ever been known, probably, or one of the few. And then as soon as something goes wrong, you don't hear a peep. And I think Brother Ross talked about this some, but unfortunately, time and chance happens to all of us. Okay? I'm a benefactor of that. I almost drowned in the ocean when I was 17 years old. Most of you know that car wreck. I did walk away, but that wasn't too far away from something else happening. Perhaps that was providence. I'm not going to get into that place, right? I agree with everything he said. I don't know. There's some things I'm going to choose to accept by faith and not worry about figuring out what they are. But we got to be real careful about proof texting. And last thing before I shut down, just because you see it on Facebook, don't go running around sharing it. Your friends may not have a clue what they're talking about, and that's okay. They're doing that sincerely, but you don't have to promote that. In fact, that might be a good opportunity to say, hey, this person's spiritually minded. Maybe we could go have a conversation and have an actual Bible study and talk about this stuff. Don't go mock them, but don't go promote them, okay? Try to go help them. So we'll stop there.